what I've what I always found curious when we were early on and when folks were benchmarking FTEs is I always had the question is how do we know that that metric, so typically area or gross square footage, how do we know that's actually correlated to FTE? I mean, so the way to think about that, just pick any metric in the hospital. You could use uh, the number of nursing staff. How do we not how do we what if our FTE was more aligned with the number of nurses,
Hmm.
or what if it was aligned more with the number of beds or patient days, right? There's all these different metrics to say, and so nobody had really ever looked statistically to say yes, there is a statistically significant association to those metrics. We've always just kind of used gross square footage. But a lot of healthcare facilities kind of had heartburn about gross square footage, for example, because it's saying, well, it's not really fair to compare myself to, an outpatient facility gross square footage versus an inpatient facility because there's all of these, additional, complex equipment and such. So that's when I started originally doing some of the research to say where could I show these ties. So what I found was the strongest predictor or the strongest association to FTEs is actually driven by the value of the assets within the facility. So that can be determined by something on the balance sheet as plant property and equipment. So the value of that building and those assets is what's really driving it. So the more expensive, the more comprehensive or complex that medical center is, it's probably going to require more FTE to maintain it and troubleshoot and those sort of things. So that's kind of a key finding. This is previous to this report, but now this report's showing, yeah, it still shows gross square footage, but it also shows current replacement value. It shows patient days. It shows admissions, and it does actually show site population. So if we have a total population of staff of X, then we can actually predict what our maintenance staff will look like. So there's a number of metrics that you can look at.
Did relative to the FTE, and I'm only focusing, I think you said you prefer the you like looking at a number of different data points. But is there one that you find more valuable than another, or it just depend on the facility you're measuring?
Um, so as I said, the 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 plant property and equipment values, which is a number that's found in the balance sheet of an organization, which is really saying this is the value of the asset, the value of the physical asset. It's showing that it has the strongest predictor to FTEs, to operating expenses. And what's beautiful about that metric is it also typically addresses whether you have a very small hospital or a very large hospital. It doesn't seem to deviate
Hmm.
much. When you look at gross square footage, for example, you find that when you go into smaller or even patient days. So some of the early reports, like in 2010, 2013, they had adjusted patient days as their primary metric. And what we found is in smaller, more rural hospitals, it actually had zero statistical correlation to FTEs and operating expenses. So that's why a lot of smaller hospitals were kind of scratching their heads saying these benchmarks just don't seem to
Yeah.
align. It's because it had no relationship. So pick any metric you want. I talk about here in the Pacific Northwest, number of pine trees. We laugh about that. Oh, what if I use the number of pine trees, per FTE? I mean, in some senses, that's exactly what was happening with some of these metrics because they had zero correlation
That's
to
good.
operating expenses. So the plant property and equipment values or current replacement values is a really strong metric that holds its association regardless of location, of size. So it's a really great metric.